So when you're starting to become a debater, it can be quite a daunting process. There are a lot of different components and things thrown at you that can be quite overwhelming. Whether it's the structure or the terms of all the different things or whatever it is, it can be quite overwhelming and complicated. The way to get past this is by looking at each piece of debate as a building block or a puzzle piece that link together. And as they link together, they allow you to really start learning things. And what we'll talk about in this video is a very, very brief overview of what those different components are, again, at the baseline, what the basic components of debate are, and then how they connect and what are some of the things you can start to learn from that. And by focusing on that, you can really start to either see the value of using it in a classroom if you're a teacher watching this video, or as a new debater, start to see, okay, this is what I'm getting myself into, this is how I could maybe use these pieces, what I can possibly get out of doing this. So debate at the most basic level, as policy debate, as we're discussing, is about two sides, an affirmative side and a negative side, discussing and arguing an issue or a plan. And the affirmative side is the one that brings the plan to the table. Think of an affirmative more as like positive, like they have something, they're holding something, they have something that they're putting on the table, which is a plan to solve a certain problem. And the negative side does not mean that they're mean because they're negative. It's they're the side that is saying, hey, that plan doesn't work, or the issue you're discussing isn't an issue we need to discuss. And throughout the debate, these two sides battle this out through 8 timed speeches, 4 for each side. And those speeches are presented in a way that is to a judge, or not to each other. So this judge is kind of like the king or the ruler or the president who is going to be listening to each side talk about his or her argument and say, hey, I think we should do this. Hey, I think we should do this. And no matter what they're doing, they're asking the judge to vote for their side, as if it could really be carried out. Then these 8 timed speeches are broken up into 2 different types, constructive and rebuttals. In the constructive speeches, which are the first half of the debate, both sides are elaborating on their entire arguments. They're bringing out all the evidence, all of the research that has gone into to preparing for the debate, all the facts, all the statistics, commentaries, whatever it is. They're reading all those pieces of evidence for the other side to hear, as well as the judge, to be able to hear, okay, there's all this work and there's all this backing it up, just like when you're writing a persuasive essay, either in 4th grade or in college, right? You have to have evidence to back up your claims. And that's what is happening in the constructives. You're outlining as many possible details about each argument as you can. Then in the rebuttals, that's when each side starts to get picking at each other, right? Start to say, they said this does not work because of this thing, etc. And being as much more specific and directed at how the other person is arguing their arguments and what they're arguing. Whereas the constructives are much more about outlining as much about each argument as humanly possible, with as much evidence as humanly possible. And then in the rebuttals, you start to pick apart what those arguments were and why they really don't work. In between the affirmative speeches is something called cross-examination. Cross-examination is when you do actually get to talk to the other side, and that's when you get to ask questions. Cross-examination is an interesting time because it's all improv, no matter what. You can practice beforehand and maybe think about what they may say, what they may ask you, but at the end of the day, you're never really going to know what is inside the other team's head. So they're going to ask you questions that are going to try to ask for clarification. Possibly you said something too quickly, or you mentioned a concept that was unclear, and they want clarification so they know how to argue it. Or they're going to start asking you questions that are a little bit more tricky to see if they can poke holes into your argument. Cross-examination is really interesting that way because it can go a bunch of different ways. The special part of cross-examination, aside from the fact that you get to speak directly to each other, is that it's not flowed, which brings us to this next element of debate, which is flow. Flow is the term for essentially taking notes of the entire debate. It's setting up your paper into 8 columns, a column representing each speech, and having different sheets of paper for each issue. And in either another video or in your class or in a debate textbook, you'll learn much more about flowing and the techniques of flowing. But the idea of the flow is that it shows you almost like a timeline how an argument progresses through the entire debate. And it's very key to following arguments, especially when there are so many different pieces of evidence involved. But in cross-exes, you don't flow those. Then there's all this jargon, all these terms that are involved in debate. Things like disad, ad, harms, impacts, fiat, critique, topicality, and a whole bunch more. And at first, it's very complicated and confusing to understand what all these mean and why it's even necessary. Why can't you just say the bad part of their argument was? And at the end of it, it's because these terms represent really specific kinds of argumentation techniques or parts of different arguments. And by every team member having these terms under their belt, when you're using them to argue against the other side and you mention that, the judge knows what you're talking about and the other side knows what you're talking about. So this language of debate is really a tool to help you start to understand how arguments are constructed. They're not there to make it impossible for you to argue, even though they may seem difficult to use at first. So these speeches are about presenting arguments. The cross-exes are about creating dialogue and creating clarification. And the rebuttals are about attacking arguments instead of constructing them, instead of presenting them. And then the jargon and all the different terms and vocabulary relating to these debates have to do with learning how you're actually building those arguments. Imagine building a car, right? You have different parts of the car, and those different parts have different names, and the tools you use to build the car using those parts have their own specific names too, right? It's the same thing with debate in all these different terms. You're using these terms to construct the debate and to communicate those argumentative elements to the other side. Because of all these different components, debate can start to teach you a lot about thought process, speaking, and how to construct arguments. You're doing research beforehand, which is a written step and a written act. You're practicing speaking, is your oral. You're trying to construct how you're going to present something out loud within the time limit to someone else. You are also practicing active and critical listening as you're listening to what the other side is saying, trying to figure out what you're going to say next, what evidence of yours you could use to combat what they're saying, and then even more critical than that, what questions can you craft from those opposing ideas to ask during cross-examination. So there are a wide variety of learning opportunities here in debate for you, whether you're just someone who's interested in maybe practicing public speaking more, or someone who's interested in looking at how to do more effective research. The whole gamut. So debate has it all, and all those different pieces are fitting together to help you be the best debater possible. Let them help you